think we can get started. I think we can get started with our event tonight. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the very first Client Center event in 2024. My name is Chaoning Su. I'm the director of the Client Center for Culture and Globalization here at Oakland University. As a young platform established in 2021, our mission is to encourage more conversation on cultural differences and international affairs. And tonight's panel embodies that spirit. So as we know, more than 64 countries are heading to the polls this year, making 2024 the year of democracy. As the very first electoral event of the year, the presidential and legislative elections in Taiwan have become the focal point for the world to observe the clash between ideologies and the resilience of democracy. The results of this election will also have significant impacts on geopolitics and cross-strait relations. So it is a great honor tonight to have three experts with us to share their thoughts on this topic. We have Dr. Shelley Rigger, who is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of Faculty at Davidson College in North Carolina. She is one of the most prominent voices in East Asian politics. Her book, Why Taiwan Matters, has long been the key reading for anyone interested in understanding US-China-Taiwan relations. We also have Dr. Sara Newland, who is the Assistant Professor of Government of Smith College. Her scholarship focuses on subnational diplomacy and in particular on the role that state and local officials play in the complicated relationship between the US, China, and Taiwan. And last but not least, we have Dr. Wei-Ting Yan, who is the Assistant Professor of Government at Franklin and Marshall College. As a political scientist, Dr. Yan's research focuses on governance and welfare state development in Asia. More specifically, she looks into how young democracies create social protection regimes for their citizens. And I want to mention that we are in for a real treat today because not only the three experts that we have are real experts on this topic, but they were on the ground in Taiwan just 2 weeks ago to observe the election. Throughout their perspectives, I believe we are all going to gain valuable insights on the election and its broader implications. So without further ado, let's start tonight's conversation. Well, Wei-Ting, Sara, and Shelley, I thought we can start with a discussion on the overall presidential election and its results. So who were the main candidates, their platforms, and what were you most interested in watching for this election? Wei-Ting, you want to start with that question?
Yeah, so for this electoral cycle, it was both a presidential election as well as an election for the legislature. And so the presidential election, we know after November, there are three candidates. One is the sitting Vice President Lai Ching-te, who is the president-elect, and we have Hou You-yi representing the KMT, and we also have a third candidate, Ko Wen-je, representing Taiwan People's Party, which is a newly founded party that was just 4-year-old. And very quickly, if there's people still don't know the result, the DPP wins presidency while losing the majority in the legislature. The legislature, now the majority is dominated by the KMT. However, they only had 52 seats plus 2 pro-KMT independent seats. So they have 54 seats in total. The DPP lost 10 seats from last election. So the DPP now has 51 seats. The newly founded Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, has managed to secure 8 seats, making it like a critical role moving forward. And I want to make two very quick comments about this election or how I interpret the result. My first point is that actually, I think for domestic voters, it is quite a boring election. Everything kind of was expected. I mean, for about 6 months, we didn't know who was actually competing. We kind of only knew about that last week of November. So before November, it was very dull because we don't know who the candidates were. And after November, December, and so it was like really like December was the month for campaign. And we saw something, but still by that point, we kind of anticipated that it's likely going to be the DPP winning the presidency, the KMT capturing the legislature, which was how it turned out. And if you talk to people in the society, they also feel very different, that it's not an existential election for them. Not like in 2020 when there was a Hong Kong event going on in 2019, lurking in the back of people's head. This time, people kind of view that as that's just another election. I heard a lot of people telling me that that's just another election. And so to some extent, it is kind of a good thing, because I feel like people don't feel like every election is about sovereignty. I think that's a good sign for Taiwan. So it seems like the international community is more excited about this election than Taiwanese voters. That's like my first feeling. My second point is, the only surprise for me in this election is how good the TPP has performed. I think they outperformed my expectation, and I think it's a very interesting phenomenon from a research perspective. And I will stop it here because I don't really know. I mean, we can discuss who the voters are, but I can only speculate at this moment. We don't have enough data, I would say, to say too much about who they really are, why are they really supporting Ko-Wen-je. Yes.
Shelley, Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. I agree with everything that Wei-Ting said. You know, I was really struck after the election by a lot of the English language international media coverage, which pretty much all had headlines like, "In defiance of China, Taiwanese voters, give the DPP a third term in the presidency." And that wasn't at all the way that it felt to me on the ground in Taiwan in this election. It was how it felt on the ground in 2020, when I think the DPP very effectively sort of mobilized the symbols of what was happening in Hong Kong and said, this election really is a choice about Taiwan's future and Taiwan's free and democratic future, right? Whether that is possible. If you want that to be possible, you have to vote for the DPP. And this time it really didn't feel that way, right? It felt like, with possibly the exception of Ko-Wen-je of the TPP, who has this like passionate, if relatively small base of supporters, no one was that excited about the candidates from the other two parties. And, a lot of the differences boil down to, some differences between the two parties in terms of their views on the appropriate relationship between China and Taiwan and what that relationship should look like. It also, in this election, boiled down to some degree on voters' views about the relationship between Taiwan and the US, and the degree to which by sort of pulling closer to the US, the DPP administration has made Taiwan more secure or less secure. The KMT's claim was that, Taiwan risks sort of antagonizing China if it's too close to the US. The DPP's claim was that Taiwan needs to protect itself from an aggressive next door neighbor, and close ties to the US are an appropriate way to do that. So there are, some real policy differences between the two, but it did not feel to me like people were going to the polls and saying, man, we're really going to stick it to China this time with this election. It did feel like, Taiwan's democracy has deepened and evolved, and people have kind of enduring partisan preferences. That's driving a lot of what is driving them to the polls, but it didn't feel like people were responding to a sense of existential threat.
Do you feel the same way, Shelley? You were on the ground and you being in Taiwan many, many times to observe different elections. Do you feel the same way about this election?
Yeah, I agree with both Sarah and Wei-Ting. And I also just want to pause for a second and thank you so much, Professor Su, for putting this together. You too are very knowledgeable on this topic, and I hope you'll weigh in when you have something to say. But yeah, Taiwanese have been voting in these truly democratic elections since the mid-1990s. And elections of kind of limited democratic nature even before that. And every year we sort of imagine maybe this year will just be normal, boring. We don't have to go because everything will be very predictable. And every year there's something else that's interesting. I agree with Sara that it did not feel at all like a rebuke of China or some kind of gutsy move by Taiwanese voters. At the same time, though, there were things to find interesting in this round of elections. For me, one thing that was really interesting was, despite the fact that it's not an existential election, the turnout by American standards, at least, was still really high, over 70%. And that's of eligible voters, not some kind of slice of the electorate that has gone to the trouble of registering to vote. That's anybody who's eligible. And over 70% of them voted. Another thing that I found really interesting this time was the mixed result. So the last two elections, the DPP has won the presidential election and has gained a legislative majority. This time around, everybody won a little bit and everybody lost a little bit, which I think for all three parties kind of feels like they lost, because what you really want to do is you want to win. But the DPP certainly did win the presidential election, although with only 40% of the vote, which is not a particularly strong mandate. So makes it maybe a little bit more challenging for the next few years. The DPP lost its legislative majority, but interestingly enough, in the electoral district races, the DPP actually got the most votes. DPP got 45% of the vote to the KMT, the second finishers, 40%. So it's not gerrymandering in the American way that can create disproportionality between the votes cast and the seats won. It's more about every locality has to have at least one seat. So it's kind of like the US Electoral College, where every state, no matter how small, has at least one electoral seat. But I thought that was kind of a good result for the DPP, that people did turn out for their legislative candidates. Their legislative candidates did better than their presidential candidate in the districts. So their base is strong, I would say, and they can feel confident that they'll be able to come back. The KMT was the leaders of the KMT very disappointed that they lost a third consecutive presidential election. But the KMT actually did really well in the district legislative races also. They won a lot more seats, not enough to capture a majority, but they also did well in the proportional representation portion of the legislature, which is 34 seats that are elected on a party list vote. So people showed support for the KMT. So there's going to be a lot of discussion in the next 4 years. Is the KMT dead? Because they've lost 3 presidential elections in a row. And I would say absolutely not. They did well in local elections 2 years ago, and they showed their base is still working in local politics. Now, last thing I'll say is the TPP, which, oh my gosh, you guys, for the next, as long as the TPP is out there, we have to be so careful with our diction when we're differentiating between the DPP and the TPP. But the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, with its 20% of the presidential vote and 20% of the party vote in that party list portion of the legislative election, shows that from a party standpoint, they can feel like they have 20% support at least at this moment. Their district candidates did terrible. All of them were totally defeated. So they don't have any base. But as a sort of party preference, I want something different. I want an alternative to KMT and DPP. You know, the TPP definitely has something to brag about there. So there was like winning and losing for everybody.
Thank you so much. And I think it's so interesting to talk about this new political force, TPP, in this election. I think as Waiting mentioned that you were surprised by the turnout, the vote they received, TPP. Shelley was talking about how we really need to pay close attention to the role of TPP playing in Taiwan's political landscape in the coming 4 years. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this newly established political force? What do they stand for? A lot of people say they got a lot of like votes from the younger generation. Was that true? How are they going to reshape, you know, policy formation, the cross-strait relations, and everything else?
I'm happy to start and then other folks can jump in. So, you know, the TPP is, some folks will disagree with me about this, but in some ways I think a classic like populist party where, you know, it's really formed around an individual who has a kind of anti-establishment message, Kawenja. He emerged out of a social movement, the Sunflower Movement. So he initially was quite critical of the KMT government that was in power at the time. But, you know, his message really has come to be both of the major parties are bad. There's too much focus on cross-strait relations, and they're not paying attention to anything else. And he tries to position himself as a kind of like brilliant technocrat who is going to come up with better policy solutions to the things that actually affect people's daily lives. He's a surgeon and like makes a big deal of his medical background, and I think sees himself as kind of uniquely qualified, uniquely like smart enough to solve Taiwan's policy problems. I think the result of that, not just for the TPP, but for a lot of parties that are organized around a kind of charismatic or you know, a figurehead who attracts a lot of loyalty and attention, is that they don't really have a strong institutionalized party, and they don't really have, so organizationally, I think the party is quite weak, but also they don't really have clear policy positions. And so, you know, if you ask them, like, what is your position on blank issue, on a lot of them, they don't really have a good answer. And the answer has mostly boiled down to criticizing the policies that the KMT and the DPP have put forward, especially the DPP since they've been in power the last 8 years. And so now I think the question is, as Wei-Ting mentioned, the TPP is in this important role in the legislature where they only have 8 seats, but because neither of the major parties has a majority on its own, the TPP actually will have a lot of power. And it's not really clear how they are going to wield that power. And they've kind of set themselves this high bar of, you know, claiming like we're going to be better than these existing parties at solving anything. And so if they wind up being an impediment to policymaking, I think that will seem very sort of contradictory with some of the promises that they've made. If they align themselves really closely with either the DPP or the KMT, that's going to seem to contradict the promises they made and this idea that both existing parties are bad. And so in some ways, I think they're in a difficult position now. And structurally, I think they also are in a difficult position because the party is so organized around Ko Wen-je, but because he ran for president and lost, he does not have a position in government now. And so I think there's this open question of whether he's going to let the folks who are in the legislature from his party lead and become, you know, like important political figures in their own right, or whether he's going to insist on continuing to have the party be all about him.
Shelley and Waiting on TPP and the youth vote.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic summary of the dilemma facing the TPP. one after another third party in Taiwan has arisen, and one after another third party in Taiwan has declined or disappeared. Usually it's because they can't agree internally within those parties about either about the positions they want to take or about the strategies they want to follow in order to be or not to be a positive, constructive force in politics. And I think for Ko Wen-je, probably the sort of political move that's more appealing is to be obstructionist. But for the rest of his party, being obstructionist means you just turned into the thing that you were condemning for the entire existence of your party. So I think Sara really nailed it. It's a very, very tough situation. But a lot of people, a lot of voters, we can actually tell you how many voters, right? 20% of the electorate said, I want an alternative to the KMT and the DPP. And this was the alternative that was offered, and other alternative parties have not been able to get as high as 20% support. So I don't think what we saw in terms of the TPP's performance was so much an endorsement of the TPP, certainly not an endorsement of its positions, which are extremely vague. And, it's kind of like if whatever you think about an issue, you can find a time when somebody from the TPP was on your side. You can also find times when they were not on your side, but, if you're looking for data points to support that vote, they're out there. But I don't think most people were really saying, I love the TPP. Some people were saying, I really love Ko Wen-je for reasons that we can talk about more. But I think most of the TPP's strength is really about, I want something different. The KMT doesn't impress me. The DPP has been in power forever. Who else is out there? And Ko Wen-je really rode that sentiment very successfully this time.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Sara and Shelley was talking about. When we talk about who voted for Ko Wen-je, my observation is that there are just three types of voters, right? The first type is people who voted for DPP last time in 2020. They're light green, and they're just tired of 8 years of DPP governance, which from my perspective is totally normal. They're just functioning like citizens in normal democracy. They want check and balance. They want party turnover. And so that's the first source of voters supporting TPP. The second source is basically the light blue, because Ko Wen-je managed to shift himself from a pro-green candidate to become a pro-blue candidate. And he does, I think, attract some of the voters who are light blue. And then there is this he has core supporters. And based on our understanding, his core supporter profile is basically young male, highly educated, educated young male, age 20 to 29. And so there are people who truly believe in Ko Wen-je and what he stands for, his populist discourse. And so I think it will be very interesting, like Sara said, like now they're in this very weird, like they're actually very difficult position for them. If we observe from the the election that just passed 2 days ago, it's a very clear demonstration of how TPP was trying to, they got in between. They don't want to be classified as a pro-green party. They also don't want to be classified as a pro-blue party. In the end, the last day before the speaker's election, they just say, we're going to nominate our own people. And then they strategically not voting in the second round to help Han Kuo-yu of the KMT to win the speaker's position. And so what I observed in the speaker's election was that the TPP in the end still tried to position themselves at this moral high ground and to be positioning in that, moral high ground position. And I think it's going to be very difficult for them, not just for them, I think for the legislature in the next 4 years. But I also think that their strategy, based on what I observe, I feel like their strategy right now is aiming for local election in 2026 already. They're already thinking about how to maintain in this high level moral position in order to maintain the voter base in 2026. But I don't know how successful this strategy, how long this strategy can be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a really strange idea that the moral high ground is to ask people to vote for you and then to refuse to take a position. You know, so you gave us, our voters gave us the ability to determine the outcome. We don't want it. We're not helping, you know? That I've sorry, I'm going to take a position here in I hope that they are not rewarded for that, because the essence of representative government is responsibility and accountability. And if you refuse to participate and you refuse to use your vote, in this case, your seats, to guide the nation in the direction that you believe based on your principles and, as Kowenjo would tell us, reason, pragmatism, and utilitarianism, science, you just punt. Like, what the heck?
Yeah, and that's how we now see that we have a new speaker in the Legislative Yuan, Han Guoyu, KMT, and also has a China-leaning kind of position. So I want to ask you guys, how do you see this new speaker of Legislative Yuan would shape the policy formation process, the cross-strait relations, or do you think the speaker is actually more symbolic than have some practical impact on everything else?
Well, I will throw out two thoughts. I mean, I think we'll have to wait and see. Ideally, theoretically speaking, that should be an impartial role. And the Congress, I think his role mainly, people have been talking about, diplomacy, like Congress level diplomacy, has been something the speaker would focus on, given Taiwan's complicated diplomatic relation with other countries. And so far, I think he's trying to uphold to that impartial role, but I don't know, we really will have to wait and see. But I do want to make, I guess, following what we were just talking about, like the TPP's position, I feel like it's going to be a hard job to be the speaker of the legislature in the next 4 years, if based on what just happened in how the election, turned out for the speaker. Because this is the first time Taiwan has a three-party. I mean, previously we had three parties before, but it's the first time I think we have a third party that tried to assert its position as non-blue and not green. And so this three-party situation, I think it's an uncharted territory for Taiwan's politics. And I feel like it will require a lot of informal rules for cooperation to really happen, to, cross the aisles, to talk to each other in a reasonable way. In this situation, usually we will say trust is a very valuable commodity to make this happen. And so if you ask me how I will predict in the next 4 years, I would say the legislature start off to a very wrong start. There's basically no trust between anyone after the speaker's election. And TPP just sued, Taiwan People's Party just sued DPP, about the speaker election. And so I feel like moving forward, it's just going to be very chaotic, like legislative process in the next 4 years. That's my wild guess.
Yeah, during Ma Ying-jeou's presidency, the speaker was from his own party, and it was a chaotic mess.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to watch, in part because Han Kuo-yu himself is a really interesting figure and someone who, you know, is very beloved of the kind of like deep blue pro-China base of the KMT, but you know, he's a really polarizing figure, right? A lot of people who aren't from that deep blue base absolutely hate him. And he was the KMT's presidential candidate 4 years ago. He was a terrible general election candidate, right? Because he was so unpopular with people other than that deep blue base who saw him as really dangerous, right? Someone who really wanted to pull Taiwan too close to China. And so, you know, I think we were talking before about the kind of risks to the TPP of their position. I think in some ways that's also true of the KMT, right? They're more powerful now than they have been for the last 8 years because now they, you know, they control the speakership and the legislature. But, you know, I think I think he's someone who could really like reinvigorate a lot of DPP voters potentially to come out in 4 years, right, and vote against the KMT if he's too provocative. And you know, so I think that he's someone who he's a big personality and I think has his own vision for things and may not want to be kind of constrained and may not want to be polite. But there's also, I think, some risks to the KMT sort of overplaying their hand.
Right. And so we have some really interesting figures in legislative yuan this time. We have Han Kuo-yu as the speaker. We have, you know, Huang Guochang from TPP. And I also want to mention, I think 40% of the newly elected legislators, they are first-time legislators. They were local congressmen before this election. So I think that will be a steep learning curve for a lot of them. So not just chaos that we are going to see this time around. I think it's gonna take longer time for some of the legislators to learn the policy formation process, the negotiation. So really, it's gonna be a bumpy ride. But beyond the three parties that we were talking about, I think a lot of people would argue that they were a fourth party in this election. That was the CCP, China, right? So a lot of observers, they try to, you know, frame this election through the framework of China. They either talk about the Chinese interference in the election or how, you know, different candidates use the China factors for their platform. I want to just ask you guys for your take on how China or China factors being framed throughout this election season, and what are some of the most interesting observations about, you know, Chinese interference and everything.
Well, one thing I would say is for listeners who are, as listeners to this kind of program often are, worried about the possible consequences of an outcome in this election that the PRC did not prefer. So the PRC puts a lot of weight on the presidential elections, and when the DPP wins the presidential election, that is disappointing to the Chinese Communist Party leadership because they believe that the DPP is the party most opposed to Beijing's preferences. So there's always a little bit of concern, I guess, for some people. Well, the Taiwanese voters have once again put the DPP in power, or at least in the executive branch in power. So what is that? How's Beijing going to react? And I think Beijing's reaction has been relatively muted so far. You know, they stole away one of Taiwan's diplomatic partners immediately after the election, but it was a very minor diplomatic partner and certainly nothing that surprised anybody in Taiwan. But I think the one reason that the reaction was somewhat muted is that actually, if you're in mainland China and you're doing Taiwan analysis, Taiwan election political analysis for your leaders, you have a very good story, a very positive story to tell them, to calm them down, to alleviate their concern about Taiwan's direction, and honestly, to buy a little bit more time for this relationship to find its way to a more stable or less high conflict situation, which is that 60% of the voters in the presidential election did not vote for the DPP candidate. They voted for other people. And the DPP is now is no longer in a position to determine on its own the direction of national policy. So I think from the PRC government's standpoint, this actually was not a bad result, despite the fact that Lai Ching-te won the presidential election, which of course is not their favorite thing.
Yeah. Sara or Wei-ting on this topic?
Yeah, I think I agree with that in theory. My experience of, talking to Chinese analysts has been that I think they overestimate the autonomy of the president within a democratic system, and really sort of overemphasize the importance of what they see as like the true feelings in the president's heart, right? And so although I would also, if I were sitting in Beijing, I would look at these results with some optimism, right? To say, okay, this was not, a clear, overwhelming victory for the DPP. I'm not 100% sure that that's actually how people in Beijing are going to interpret things. I think they don't trust Lai Ching-te and they worry about him a lot. I think, another interpretation, and time will tell about this, but another interpretation of the muted reaction that we've seen so far is that obviously with the, the divided result between the executive and the legislative branch, I think it's possible that Beijing is worried about sort of coming on too strong in a way that was going to maybe affect the results of the speaker, the election for speaker. And, my guess is that they are kind of, they did have a very muted response initially after the election, as Shelley said. I think we'll have to see what their response continues to be like after Inauguration Day, for instance, and also now that we kind of know a little bit more about how the legislature is sorting itself out. I hope that we are not going to see a more provocative response than we've seen so far, but I do think it's a little bit of an open question.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And they definitely really don't trust and really don't like Lai Ching-te. They think he's, Chen Shui-bian was worse than Li Denghui. Tsai Ing-wen in their view, was worse than Chen Shui-bian, which is kind of nuts, but that is definitely what they've always told us. And Lai Ching-te is worse than Tsai Ing-wen, so he's just the worst of the worst. And yet, when you talk to people in the PRC, when you talk to analysts of Taiwan politics in the PRC, they do put it seems to me that they are always looking for evidence that their strategy is succeeding. I think failure of the PRC's approach to cross-strait relations is catastrophic because it leaves Beijing with very few options and none of them good. So they're always looking for evidence that what they did actually had the desired effect. And it's also an important part of their strategy to maintain that the people seeking independence in Taiwan are a small minority. They say it all the time, and I think they need for it to be true. So that's where I'm really coming from. Not that they are not totally unhappy about Lai Ching-te, but that given the alternative, which would have been, 57% for the DPP in the presidential vote like 4 years ago, and a DPP legislative majority. This was actually a much weaker showing for the DPP, and that you can spin in your mind for your own leaders, and especially for the Taiwanese, the PRC general public. You can spin that as things are headed in a good direction.
I don't have much to add. I agree with everything they just said. I guess the only thing I would say is that I think moving forward, it looks like the PRC is not going to talk to Lai Ching-te. So it seems like it's the situation that has continued since Taiwan inaugurated, which is, Beijing cut off communication with Taiwan, will continue. I think it will be important for Lai Ching-te in his inauguration speech, at least to, symbolically show his willingness to talk to Beijing, even if Beijing doesn't want to accept that. I think it's important for parties in Taiwan to make that gesture. And I think now with the KMT dominating the legislature, if I were CCP, I would be thinking about continue working with the KMT, and there are just more ways to leverage my influence now, given that the KMT now has more power in the legislature. And so I think that's the places where we're going to see PRC's influence the most, or trying to exercise its influence the most moving forward.
Right, right. And other than China, I think US and US-China relations also play a role in this election. So I do want to ask you that, Taiwan might be the first to have the election in the year, but here in the US, we are having a presidential election coming up as well. How much do you think, China or US-China-Taiwan relations will be a topic during the US presidential election? And how do you think, the different outcomes of this election, the US election, would shape the US-China-Taiwan relations? Thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I guess I'll say a couple things. One is that I think there is a real likelihood that we will see another kind of spike in anti-China and anti-Chinese rhetoric coming out not only of, Trump, assuming he's the nominee, but, also I think some of my research is on kind of state level policy toward China and Taiwan. And we really see a lot of kind of anti-China legislation and language filtering down to the state legislative level, even to cities and towns. And so that's something that I think has real implications for, Asians living in the US, right? Folks of Asian heritage. I think this is something where, people are not going to sort of know walking down the street if they're, shouting racial slurs at someone who's originally from China or Taiwan, right? So that's something that I think is really important to just attend to, is the sort of domestic political effects of the way in which anti-China rhetoric may be mobilized in this election season. So I think that's one thing to watch out for. I think, the other thing is that obviously I think Trump's, sort of mode of thinking about foreign policy is much more isolationist, right? And sort of like America first and not interested in building alliances. And, I think one thing that has distinguished the Biden administration's approach to thinking about Taiwan is to try to build alliances of countries that might be interested in working with the US to engage more deeply with Taiwan in various ways. And that's something that I think there will be very little interest in from the Trump administration if Trump were to be reelected.
Right.
I would say I'm also most worried about, because once the US enters the electoral cycle, it's going to incentivize more hawkish, I think, gesture and behavior for election purpose. And this is where we might see, I mean, we need to worry about miscalculation. And then like right now, Biden is pressured to take actions. The middle is more aggressively because he's under a lot of pressure. And so I feel like that kind of pressure may happen if anything happens in the next 12 months between, you know, China and Taiwan. They might need to just to show stronger stance. And I think it might not be the best interest for regional stability, like overall. And of course, we're probably going to see a rematch between Trump and Biden. And Trump has already come out saying things that are a little bit worrisome, in my opinion. For example, he already say, I think in an interview, that how Taiwan steal all the semiconductor industry from the US and how he is trying to take the semiconductor industry back and all that. And so I think that's going to energize his voters, but not necessarily for, you know, Asians in the US or even, you know, US-China-Taiwan relation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that the role that foreign policy in general and Taiwan policy and US-Taiwan PRC relations in particular play in American politics is really complicated and changes from election to election. There's such a disconnect between the way many Republicans in Congress and elsewhere in the government talk about Taiwan and the way many Republican voters seem to think about US foreign policy. So it's almost like Taiwan is an exception to the isolationism that is widespread within the Republican Party, which is a thing that I think a lot of Taiwanese are quite skeptical about. You know, they worry that if US support was actually needed, the very people who are so quick to make statements in support of Taiwan will actually disappear, and suddenly they'll find themselves abandoned. You know, one of the issues that was not really too far in the background of Taiwan's presidential election was this whole idea of skepticism or suspicion of the US. And I think part of what's driving that skepticism about whether or not the US would really be there for Taiwan in the event of a crisis is a kind of over-the-top rhetorical enthusiasm for Taiwan by American politicians that's so over the top that it starts to seem incredible and not real. So I think for some Taiwanese, they look at some of the things that people in Congress say and they just think, there's no way you mean that, you know? So many people in Taiwan are beginning to wonder, is the US reliable? And there's plenty of data points in the statements from various politicians in the US that the US is not reliable and that we don't have a clear sense of direction in our foreign policy. So I think we're in for a rough road. And I hope that the Biden administration can hang on to kind of the equilibrium that it has found in the past year or so, where it is, in fact, able to simultaneously express strong substantive support for Taiwan and also steer clear of actions that reinforce the kind of paranoia in Beijing that the US is actually trying to undermine the PRC's interest in Taiwan Strait.
Right. I do want to mention that the fact that the Biden administration and the Tsai Ing-wen administration were able to work so well together Shelby Kim, who is now the vice president of Taiwan elected, played such a critical role when she was the Taiwan envoy to the US. So now with her new role as the vice president, do you see her continue to play a role in like foreign policies to enhance that US-Taiwan relations? Or do you think because of her new role, we might not see her being able to have such influence on the foreign policies?
So
Go ahead.
I mean, first of all, vice president's duty and power will be has to be authorized by the president. So Latinda will have to authorize his power to Shelby Kim for her to perform foreign affair duties. But I do believe that with her well-connected networks and her experience in Washington, this is the area that the new administration will continue relying on her to help, Taiwan navigate through Taiwan's US-Taiwan situation. Yeah.
Shelley and Sara?
I was just going to say before that this election was kind of unusual in that the vice presidential candidates from both the KMT and the DPP were really prominent and actually got a lot of play. Like the presidential candidates talked about their vice presidential running mates in the debates, which, in the US, like that would never, ever happen, right? And so it was interesting. And I think that for Lai, who's someone whose experience has all been domestic experience, and, he kind of comes out of like a local government tradition, right? So he was a city mayor, and having someone who has that really long history of international experience and obviously strong ties to the US. Her mother is American, like that's really, really, I think, valuable. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I would be very surprised if she doesn't continue to play an important role in guiding the foreign policy of the DPP, of the incoming Lai administration. It would seem like a huge waste of talent to not use her in that way. Yeah.
Channing, I wonder if I can say something about one of the questions that's in the Q&A.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is basically about whether the high stakes, particularly for Taiwan's economy, will inspire the political parties to work together in the legislature. And this is such a lovely question. I really appreciate your idealism and faith in political leaders to do the right thing. And I actually don't think it's impossible. I think on many kind of high profile and symbolic issues, we will see the three parties really stressing their differences and working hard to differentiate themselves from one another, and including the TPP, which will be difficult for them. They have to they can't just simply do nothing. I mean, they've already held back from the first major event of the legislative season, and they can't just continue to do nothing, because at some point people will notice. So they have to get in. And I think how they may be hoping to become involved is by aligning with either the DPP or the KMT on legislation based on the content of the legislation, rather than making some kind of permanent alliance with one side or the other. But it will be interesting to see whether the parties are in fact able to work together better on kind of essential bread and butter fundamental issues facing the nation, like economic management. I think they generally have. One of the things about Taiwan is that a lot of legislation passes. The legislative process is very complicated, and it forces a lot of negotiation at the committee level. And so there actually is more negotiation and compromise, I think, probably in the Taiwanese legislature than, for example, in the US Congress, because of the way the institution is set up. But we don't hear about the successes of the legislature because the parties are not particularly, they don't have a lot of incentive to talk about where they have been successful by compromising with their political opponents. So while I started out by implying that the question is idealistic, I think I kind of share your optimism that on the non-ideological bread and butter issues, they may cooperate more than you would think. I think the big issue that's going to be really important and interesting to watch is arms procurement, arms and weapons sales, whether or not the legislature will be able to pass budgets sufficient to satisfy the US expectation for what Taiwan should be doing for its own defense.
I want to very quickly add on to that comments that I think for the economic policy, another thing we want to observe would be Lai Ching-te's cabinet. I think he's right now trying to reach out across the aisles to find more broadly, broad-based to form his cabinet. And I think he particularly, I'm reading this from the news, but is that he is trying to reach out to post exit like TPP members to be part of the cabinet. We'll see if that does happen. Nothing is certain at this moment, but I would anticipate he to form a broad-based cabinet in order to, pass the bills. And another point is that I agree with Shelley, at some point TPP has to deliver. So it's most likely that they're going to deliver on social welfare policies, because that's where we see every single candidate acknowledge the housing issues, the low wage issues. So they kind of agree on this. I don't see any parties would say, no, we want to stand on the moral high ground, so we don't want to pass this bill. It would be really bad for any party holding that position. And as far as I know, one of the bills it seems to be will be one of the first bills to be discussed and debated is the reproductive assisted reproduction bill. It was already drafted, but because we're having a new legislature, they have to reintroduce the bill again. But it seems like that's the bill that they are already discussing intensively in the media. And so I think this is one of the social policy that may go on the floor in the new legislature.
Right. So how the three parties are going to work together on different policies, that's definitely something that would demand our attention and see the collaboration and competition. But I want to end our panel with a question raised by the audience. I think that's such a great question. So the question is that Taiwan is arguably the most well-behaved election ever. So what lessons can the US learn from the election in Taiwan? As here in the US, we have a presidential election coming up. So I want to hear from you, Sara, Wei Ting, and Shelley, and then use that question to end the panel on a happy note. What are some lessons that we can learn from Taiwan's election?
I think the number one lesson is that the losers graciously conceded defeat and did not claim that the election was fraudulent and, accepted the democratic process. And that seems like a simple thing, but that's part of what makes a place democratic is that, the losers, they lose and they walk away, right? So that is the number one lesson that I hope the US will take from this election.
I think the number one lesson I hope the US will take from this election is nominate good candidates. Nominate candidates that people can actually vote for with some enthusiasm. In 2020, Han Kuo-yu was a very polarizing candidate. And I think the KMT coming into the election, they thought, well, this guy, he can pull us across the finish line because he's so, to many voters, so charismatic. And the voters just discovered somewhere in the process that no, he wasn't what they were looking for. He wasn't good for the country. And he ended up really going down in flames. And this time around, against a lot of its worst impulses, the KMT nominated a candidate who was a real person, who was a genuine politician with experience and ideas and values and stuff. And, you know, you don't necessarily agree with him, but he wasn't some kind of plastic firebrand sent into the election to burn things down, which is sort of how Han Kuo-yu felt in 2020 and kind of how Ko Wen-je felt, honestly, in 2024. But I think Ko Wen-je is a much better candidate even than Han Kuo-yu. So I thought they had good candidates this year, and that the parties made sacrifices, especially the KMT. They set aside some stuff that they've been doing for a long time in order to nominate a good candidate. And I'm sort of sorry that he didn't, that without the third candidate in the race, it would have been interesting to see how well Ho-Yo-Lee could have done.
Yeah, so good candidate, exciting candidates that would mobilize the voters, and how to take failure graciously.
Who would motivate the voters without being like crazy.
Without great. So what's your take, Waiting? What's the lesson here?
Well, I think I will agree with Sarah here. I think a really good election is an election that is, I mean, if you're in Taiwan voting day, you would know that during daytime, there's like everyone is out casting vote, but it's very quiet. People kind of treat it it's very important task. And then once the ballot closes at 4 p.m., you start hearing the sounds over again. And by 8 p.m., the votes are out, and the losing party graciously say, "So we lost, and democracy wins again. We congratulate the winner," to complete the democratic process, and then everyone carries on with their life. I think that's the make it mundane, make it boring. Actually, is going to be a good lesson.
So I think with that, we will conclude our panel today, Decoding Democracy, the Implications of Taiwan's Election in 2024. And we hope that moving forward, we are going to see more elections this year. We hope to see the resilience of democracy. We hope to see some interesting, exciting candidates, as Shelley suggested. But we also hope that all candidates would just accept the result with graciously. So thank you all so much for this lovely conversation, and we wish everybody a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.